Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for coming along to the Talis Elevate community webinar series. My name is Matt East and I'm Learning Technologies Lead at Talis. Before I move on, can I just ask someone to say if you can see and hear me, please? And you can see my screen. I'm just monitoring the chat. Yes, and yes. Thank you very much, Steve. So before we start, as ever with these sessions, we are recording this and we will be sharing the content of this session afterwards. And I've tried to design this session to provide some advice and some guidance that's really related to any system that you're using whilst teaching in higher education. So not specific to Talis Elevate, apart from obviously the elements which are related directly to our data. This is primarily based on evidence, research and advice from across the community and things that we've observed whilst working with members of the Talis Elevate community over the last couple of years. And again, this is as always a shopping list of ideas, not to-do list. So I'm hoping that throughout this session you will gain a couple of nuggets of information and maybe some ideas, but this is absolutely not an exhaustive list of things to be looking to utilise unless it's relevant for you. So the outline for today, I thought it would be really useful to start this off with actually some level of criticality against data that comes from various e-learning systems, and just some awareness really to take into consideration, and that relates to Talis Elevate data as well. I'm going to aim to give a bit of an overview of the way that Talis Elevate data is presented, the questions that it's designed to try and help answer, and some of the problems it's there to try and solve, really. I'm going to give a direct example of the way that one of our members of the community, Dr Toby Carter from Anglia Ruskin, kind of fully embraced and utilised the array of Talis Elevate data that was available to him, and then talk a bit about how you could maybe look to use some of the data from Elevate for your own research, for example, both at kind of low-level testing hypotheses and up to publication. So really for learning outcomes, the goal of today is to try and build an awareness of some of the key considerations that you want to factor into your practice around any use of data when it comes to teaching and learning, to gain a better understanding of the core elements of the analytics that come directly from Elevate itself, and to see how, to gain a bit more insight into how members of the community are actively utilising the data in Elevate. So I thought it would be worth, as I mentioned, starting with some honest truths from my perspective around data. So I've been working in higher education now for around 10 years, and the growth of data, metrics, insight, has been quite dramatic, and particularly since lockdown and the introduction to this academic year. The amount of focus from grassroots academics to institutions to beyond in metrics and data that's available has grown considerably, and for very understandable reasons. But with any form of data, I always suggest or imply that there are caveats that need to be considered, and there are some fairly key factors from my perspective that need to be thought about. Firstly, the great thing about the kind of wealth of data that we have within higher education now is that there's many sources of insight that we can gain from different platforms, and I'm always quite conscious of making assumptions or deductions from a single source of the truth, unless it is a very specific hypothesis or a use case that you're trying to get an answer to. And by that I mean, if you were to take the example of Talis Elevate, if you were taking word of truth really, that a student wasn't engaging in the learning process because they weren't using Talis Elevate, that I would suggest is probably not advisable, and you may want to look at utilising other forms of data you have available, such as lecture capture systems, engagement with teams, engagement with the VLE, before you start to make any of those kind of large assumptions. And that's actually why institutions are spending a considerable amount of money now looking at creating learning analytics platforms that aggregate and pull in a huge wealth of data from the library, from the VLE, from attendance monitoring, from grading systems, all of that kind of stuff. I think that there is a level of criticality that really needs to be applied when to what data is available and what happens with that data, particularly with third-party systems which aren't endorsed by your institution as a kind of core system, if that makes sense. There are systems out there, both in the EdTech and the non-EdTech world, that obviously collect a huge amount of data, and actually the transparency around what happens with that, who owns the data, what happens with that data, is that sold to third parties? All of these kind of things are considerations that are actually out of the hands of our students when they arrive at university. And from a kind of critical perspective, I think it's really important to be conscious of the fact that that students' data is valuable and it can be incredibly useful for us. But working with certain vendors, there may be some concerns around what happens with that data. Now, some institutions will only allow core systems to be used. Others do allow some flexibility. If you're one that allows flexibility, just be really considerate of that. And I'd really recommend actually delving into a book called An Urgency of Teachers by Sean Michael Morris and Jesse Stommel, if you want to find out a bit more about some of this kind of data integrity. And if you want, that is covered quite extensively in an area called critical digital pedagogy. If you want to find out a bit more about that, I actually did an interview with Jesse last month, and we've got a recording of that interview on our blog where he covers a summation of critical digital pedagogy really clearly. Moving on to actually kind of the value of the insight you can gain from these systems. One of the things I found historically is that a myriad of EdTech systems will come with some form of data. Present very basic reports on usage, or will present some kind of statistical representation of engagement or interaction or something like that. And I found myself actually asking questions of that data on how useful is this, or actually is this just interesting? And I always try and challenge any systems that I now utilize within teaching practice on what problem is this helping me solve? What insight is this providing me that I didn't otherwise have? And I feel like actually asking those kind of questions is really core to making sure we're not just drowning in data. And finally, I think one of the things that I personally have underestimated, even with Talis Elevate, is the significant value that you can gain from qualitative data, as well as the quantitative, which we will typically be more surrounded by, I guess you could say. And I think particularly from speaking to members of the community around Talis Elevate, the level of insight that can be gained into that learning journey that our students are undertaking through the qualitative feedback they're providing in the product is incredibly valuable. And that is equally as valuable as the kind of raw number data that we can see, if not more valuable from my perspective. And finally, I've worked with a number of academics who have, I would say, falsely believed that that data is often going to answer all of the questions they have. And actually, from my perspective, the level of analytical insight that you can gain from a number of systems that you'll be using now will actually open up more questions than necessarily answers. And I think that, again, is incredibly valuable. But as a kind of false promise of this will answer all of the questions, actually, from my experience, that's not the case. I would welcome any kind of debate in the chat from anyone who has any of their own opinions on anything I've just said there, or wants to challenge me on any of that. I'd welcome that. And for me, I think that with any analytical insight that's provided from any system, it's got to really offer sort of support or opportunity, I guess you could say, in three key areas. For me, informing teaching practice can come in a number of different facets. For many systems that we use now, the data that is presented is often done so in a way that allows for adjustment after the fact. So allows for adjustment, it can inform practice for the next iteration of a module. For me, I think that actually the real value comes from being able to adjust the way that we are teaching the current students that are sat in front of us. But as long as that's in some way informing teaching practice to continuously improve and adjust and amend, then that is valuable. Targeting student support. We're in a situation right now where we don't have students in front of us, and that's where data and insight into student engagement can become even more powerful, particularly for things like retention and student support. But for me, that doesn't just cover sort of individual student support. Actually, I think there's a real opportunity for at a macro level, providing greater levels of support to our student communities when you can see patterns and trends. And I guess that really leads quite nicely onto understanding learning demographics. For me, I think there's some really interesting opportunities that haven't been explored in great depth thus far around taxonomies of learners, the different patterns and the different ways that students engage with different parts of the learning process. And that could be, as simple as some students prefer to sort of sit back and let conversation occur from their peers. Some students like to take private notes from a Talis Elevate perspective. Some students prefer to study offline. Some students prefer to only engage with resources the day before the lecture. I think there's a load of insight again that we can gain from that, and I think finding that kind of sweet spot and balance with any systems that we're using is the ideal goal here. And actually, in some ways, that's really what we've tried to focus on when it comes to the Talis Elevate analytics that are presented. So as you'll be aware, there are 3 different kind of points of focus that are typically available for any academic using Talis Elevate. There's the resource focus, which is designed really to give you an insight into how is this individual piece of content being used by my cohort. You've obviously got the kind of front page dashboard, I guess you could call it here, that gives an overview of everything from the proportion of students that are engaging, the proportion of students that are engaging with annotation activity as well, the average amount of active time that's being spent, and page by page, where is the attention by the cohort actually being spent. But there is also the students tab within that view that allows you to delve a bit deeper into individual student engagement. And a new release for this academic year also includes some of the annotation activity, both class discussion and private note taking that can occur. We've then got the module focus, which we call the module manager. Now this again is designed to give you an overview of what's happening across the duration of my module. This gives you a lot more flexibility and customization of the data, so you can start to answer very specific questions that you may have around specific resources, specific students, or specific time periods. And then finally, we've got the analytics emails that are shared every week, which are designed really just to give you an overview of what's happened this week, a very quick snapshot of what's happened over the past week of teaching. Now, delving into that a little bit deeper, I'm aware through some of the conversations that I've had that actually many users of Talis Elevate aren't necessarily aware of some of the full functionality within the module manager. And actually, what is this kind of useful for? So we've designed this tool, as I just mentioned, to be a flexible environment, giving you the ability to really delve into specific questions. And some of the questions that some of our users try to answer using this system are listed on the right. So you can see from the graphic on the left-hand side that you can very quickly and easily adjust the kind of date range that you're looking at with within the module manager to actually give you answers around things like what's happened during reading week, what has actually happened over the last month, which resources are students engaging with just before assessment hand-in, etc. Again, that is designed to inform further practice moving forward. But one thing that's important to mention here is that you will see as the chart moves, the resources in the list underneath reorder, and that's because those resources are sorted based on that time period that you've selected. You've also got the same view for your students who are involved on this cohort, and again, that is exactly the same kind of interface and exactly the same level of time-based engagement and annotation activity can be observed, but looking from a student perspective. From a resource level perspective, again, some of the questions that our community would often ask with this are listed on the left-hand side. And for me, this is a really good example of where this becomes really powerful is if you're taking up some kind of pre-sessional reading activity. Having this level of insight means that you can actually intervene, you can prompt or nudge your students a couple of days before the seminar who haven't engaged, either very targeted or in a class capacity. But you can also get that level of insight into, are the students on this module actually focusing their attention on the specific part of the resource that I was hoping to see them focus on, or I was envisaging them to focus on. So to give an example, on this chart on the bottom right here, this is a document with a number of pages, but I can see that there's a tail off throughout the resource. I know there's something really important on page 20 that I wanted the students to pick up on. I could go back into that resource, I could click on that bar in the chart, and then put a comment up and post that back to the students to drive them back into the resource in the area that is really important for them to analyse ahead of the session. And then obviously with weekly summation, we've designed this specifically. One of the key areas that we've designed within this is to give you an example of who you may need to help. So the section at the bottom of this this email around inactive students, any student who hasn't been active in a Talis Elevate resource for over 7 days will appear in that list. So you know that's a good indication that actually it's someone that you may want to just check in with, and I'll give you an example later on of where that's had a really positive impact on a member of the community's teaching. One thing I should point out with all of this as well is that Talis Elevate only records and presents what we call active engagement data. So any of these time-based metrics that you're seeing throughout the product, if a student opens a Talis Elevate resource, wanders off, makes a cup of tea, falls asleep, whatever it is, leaves it open, we stop the timer. There's some logic that's been built into the time-based metrics that we're recording here. So we're not just recording sort of open time, we're recording actual engagement, and so that's an important thing to consider here. And the other thing I will mention, as this has come up in recent conversations, you'll be aware that students can write anonymous comments within Talis Elevate. Now we're really careful with anonymity when we say that the students are anonymous within this system. So that does mean that if a student is writing comments anonymously, we do not count those comments against that student's name. Now that's just something to be aware of, particularly if you're using Talis Elevate as a mechanism for recording engagement for summative purposes and that kind of thing. We haven't had that issue yet, but we may do at some point. And finally, something that I wanted to highlight again is that we are really trying to be quite transparent with students on their own engagement. We've actually just made a change to this environment, this analytics modal that students see, to ensure that this works for students who are colourblind, for example, as part of our ongoing accessibility work. So this, you may not have seen this exact view from your students, but this is now in place within the product. For us, I think it's really important that we are transparent with students, that we are collecting data, that we are collecting it in a way that is designed to improve teaching and designed to improve student support. By presenting that back to students and articulating this presentation of data through things like student onboarding, that is designed to alleviate any concerns really around kind of hidden data collection, if that makes sense. So I wanted to go on and focus most of my attention here around a case study from one of our academics. So Dr. Toby Carter at Anglia Ruskin is an associate professor in environmental biology. He's also the chair of the institution's learning analytics workstream at Anglia Ruskin, and I've had the pleasure of working with Toby over a number of years. But I introduced Toby to Talis Elevate when I joined Talis about 2 years ago, and he had a phenomenal example of module and the impact that Elevate could have from last academic year. So to set a bit of context, Toby used this on a module with 45 students at a master's level in an MSc in conservation. Now, this is a module that had been running for a couple of years, and actually this term, semester 2, 2019-20, the module, due to its size, had actually been moved back to a face-to-face teaching from an entirely online experience. Ironically, it then went back online because of lockdown, of course. But one of the challenges that was often faced was students were really proactive and vocal in live sessions, i.e. in a lecture. Loads of conversation going on, but actually the level of online discussion and the level of kind of pre or post-sessional conversation that occurred was actually quite challenging. And because of time constraints and the level of data and information that was actually within this module and the variety of information, there was a general kind of lack of contextual criticality, really, was the language that Toby used. Students weren't delving into the detail. There were very much surface level conversations that were occurring. So when Talis Elevate was presented, it offered a great opportunity for obviously building deeper conversation into content as well. So Toby, like many of our Elevate users, started off by presenting kind of a weekly reading. That could have been things like a journal article or even just lecture notes, that kind of thing. Many government reports were used on this module as well because of the nature of the subject matter. And actually, as Toby started to get a better understanding of the way the data was presented and the possibilities that came from this data, Toby started playing around with a number of new concepts, for example, A/B testing. So again, because of the subject matter, there's a wealth of media content that's available around some of the weekly topics. So Toby actually started to find matching similar resources, one in video format, one in document format, and was able to start to observe patterns that students in some cases were, in some subject areas, were veering towards the video content initially and then going towards the text-based content. And likewise, the amount of conversation that was occurring in one medium or another, Toby was able to observe patterns from that. And so over the 12 weeks of the teaching, Toby started to utilize Talis Elevate to prove and disprove a number of different hypotheses around student engagement with resources. He was then able to use students' qualitative feedback and actually use the functions of Elevate to try to encourage students to crowdsource and to share resources they felt were particularly interesting. This actually allowed Toby to then adjust the kind of ebbs and flows of his teaching based on the contributions that the students were making. What was really powerful about this actually is he was getting students to demonstrate their own levels of criticality in subject matter. For example, presenting a paper on a specific subject, asking the students to find a really good example of that content, of that subject matter in a video format or in an infographic or something along those lines, or vice versa again. That then allowed Toby to change the subject matter for the following weeks, and this became a regular pattern. But as Toby observed that through giving students this kind of collaborative environment, both for conversation but also for sharing resources, the general level of conversation kept increasing, the level of personal note-taking increased, and actually the level of weekly engagement with resources continued to increase. And through the insight that Toby was gaining into which resources students had a preference over, or the patterns of activity, he then started uploading additional things, such as case studies that he'd written for kind of diagnostic activity. And I think critically for me, assessment literacy tasks, building in specific activities so that students were peer reviewing past submissions or applications for ethics approval and that kind of thing. So the way that we described this during the teaching was actually data-led learning design adjustment. So by everything from being able to see that shorter resources were getting a much higher proportion of attention from the students. In some subject areas, visual media was getting the student preference over textual information, particularly in the first instance. Toby was able to make those adjustments, and as you can see, a quote from him on the right-hand side. It was really interesting to see what resources students were gravitating towards. And actually, I thought what was really pertinent for me here was that Toby's expectation of what was going to be popular for students wasn't reality. And I suspect actually that is the case in a number of different areas that we teach in, and it probably varies quite significantly year in, year out as well with different cohorts of students, although I'm yet to prove that. And I think taking that a little bit further, as this continued over the 12 weeks, Toby had repeated patterns and kept evolving the activity that he was developing with these students. Actually, towards the latter part of the lockdown period, really, of the term, so week 6 onwards, I believe it was for him, Toby started uploading the lecture recordings as well. This was actually something that the students requested so that they could make their own private notes on lecture recordings, with some interesting findings, which I'll highlight to you later on. Well, in fact, right now. So what did Toby actually kind of learn from this data? One of the interesting things, as you can see from this, the data on the chart on the left-hand side, the blue data, the types of spikes you would anticipate. Teachings on a Tuesday, spikes on a Monday and Tuesday. Absolutely saw that. But actually the repetition of use throughout of resources throughout the term, not just at key points in assessment periods, was quite surprising, I think, and specifically the kind of bunching that occurred around specific resources getting repeat use. This module had an assessment which was an assignment, a couple of assignments throughout the term, but primarily a larger assignment right at the very end. And those patterns weren't necessarily correlated towards the topic of conversation in the assignments. So actually from that we could deduce that students were going back and reviewing some of the content throughout their own kind of independent study activity, not just when that was presented. And that's the kind of thing that, from my perspective, we've never really been able to observe very easily with traditional systems like VLEs, for example. And as I mentioned earlier on, I think one of the key things that Toby learned here was the unexpected preference to content, both in format, but also in subject matter. And by that I mean thematic subject matter. If talking about migration patterns in this module, the students on this course had a preference over oceanic migration rather than bird migration, for example. So a couple of other things that I wanted to just pick up on. These are some of the things that Toby actually really tried to act on. So adjusting the content based on the student engagement I talked about already. The level of diagnostic insight that Toby was able to gain from both the qualitative and quantitative insight he was gaining from this, literally setting specific activities where the student contributions gave him an insight into the level of knowledge and understanding of that subject matter. For me, the most important thing here is that he was able to adjust his teaching in flight, but also, the learning that he took from this module has then informed the delivery for this coming term, as you would expect from many other systems. A really interesting example from that is that the lecture recordings that were put up were actually the resource type or the content type that had the lowest amount of engagement across all of the resources uploaded to this module, and there were about 70 of them, I think. So even though the students requested them, they weren't actually watched. Now, again, we can't make an assumption that that's going to be the case for every single course, but I found that really interesting, particularly as these were uploaded at the request of the students, and they were uploaded during lockdown as well. So, a lot more investigation that needs to be done there. But for me, one of the most important things was Toby was able to target students. He was able to target student support and student help when he could see that students were not engaging, were not interacting in a class capacity, for example, or weren't actually getting involved in taking any private notes at all. I'm just going to take a quick drink. Give me 1 second. So just a couple of other examples from the community, and this kind of builds on some of the points that Toby enacted on his module as well. But one of the things I think is a really good opportunity here is this concept of A/B testing and giving students a choice where applicable in how they can gain knowledge on specific subject matter. And I'm sure that many of you can find examples of content you've created within your institutional environment, or content that's available on the web. So presenting a subject in media format, or in document format, or in image format, for example, or even just in slides or a podcast. And we've seen some great examples from colleagues who are now making use of things like podcasts that they've produced in-house or are available as open access resources that students are listening to, as they're out running and things like that, which is a really a great mechanism for absorbing information. But the thing that I think is really valuable here is that it means that we can make those adjustments to the way that we're teaching based on what we're seeing from the data. And actually, we've had feedback from academics who, which I think is really important, again, to feed back to your students and actually let them know that you're adjusting your preference for teaching materials based on the observations that you're making. And I think this came as a really positive surprise for me. But actually, hearing a story from one of our users, Renan Peterson Wagner at Leeds Beckett University, who shared a story of his experience of utilising this data around lack of engagement, and actually just checking in with the students and demonstrating that he cared, basically. And the fact that the students were really grateful. I think now more than ever that kind of stuff's really important. And there's obviously some concerns in some areas around potentially a sort of big brother activity, but for me that kind of example of of getting in touch because you care is really powerful and shouldn't be underestimated, and I'm sure it's something that many of you are already doing. I wanted to finish up by giving you some food for thought around research opportunities using Talis Elevate data as well. So we've actually got two publications that are at free publication. They're at peer review for journals at the moment, that have been made possible through the use of Talis Elevate data, specifically looking at things like resource engagement and active time engagement. And for example, the top submission here is looking at the correlation between engagement using various mediums and attainment, which I think is an area of real interest for many, obviously. The data that we present to you in Talis Elevate is obviously recorded in a data warehouse. That data can be collected or stored as an hour-by-hour aggregation, or by a daily aggregation, as it typically is. And this can be available, it can be made available in the raw format if that's something that would be of interest to you. Likewise, if you would like to get a download of annotation activity that's occurred on your module, do raise a support ticket, and that's something that we can certainly help with. And personally, I'm actually really interested to undertake any kind of research opportunities using Talis Elevate and other systems that you may want to undertake. So really keen to hear of anyone who would like to look into doing some kind of research activity with the activity that they're doing in Elevate. So please do get in touch if that's something of interest. So just to kind of wrap this up, I've talked a lot about some kind of overarching, I guess, thoughts and considerations when it comes to utilizing data. But for me, these are some of the kind of top things really. So making both use of qualitative and quantitative, I think for something particularly like Talis Elevate is really, really valuable. And as I say, the level of insight you can gain from the contributions that students are making is actually probably more valuable than some of the data that you can get out of the system from a quantitative perspective. Do be aware though of making deductions on student engagement, particularly from a single source of truth. You obviously are using VLEs, you're using things like Panopto or Teams, and your institutions will likely be doing some kind of aggregation or consolidation into a single platform. Do make use of those areas that have multiple forms of data being fed into them. I would highly recommend, if you're data savvy or you're interested in data, setting a couple of hypotheses and just trying to prove and disprove those through using the data. That's all part of continuous improvement, continuous learning. I do recommend adjusting in flight if you have the kind of cognitive bandwidth in which to do so. I appreciate there's a lot going on right now. And I think the final thought from me is, if you are making changes to your teaching based on these observations, do make sure you're feeding back to your students, just so that they're aware that you're paying attention, that you're caring, that you're listening, you're observing, and that if something doesn't work, they should be open and honest with you. So thank you very much for coming along to that. I hope that's been useful and interesting for you. The next webinar that we're running is going to be slightly different, and actually, because we've seen such significant growth in Talis Elevate this academic year, we're opening this up to members of the community to share actually what they've achieved through their use of Elevate this year. For any of you who are on the call, I really would welcome contributions from you. We'll be opening up sort of 10-minute presentations with questions from members of the community for an hour-long session, and really useful opportunity to share good practice, share experience, and share what worked and what didn't work. So hopefully see you there. Again, we will be sharing a copy of this webinar and a copy of the slides in a follow-up email. And for those of you who have been sharing your experiences on the Talis Elevate hashtag, thank you. It's really good to see all of the great stuff that's going on with Elevate, and I do encourage the rest of you to do the same. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you in December.